Good evening, folks. This is part 2 of our Gameolgy series on survival horror. If you haven't checked out the first part, be sure to do that before you click on this video. Okay, so last time I gave a basic idea of what I thought made something a survival horror game, and the three important aspects that I honed in on were obviously trying to be scary, resource management, and combat. But there was something else that I brought mention to in that video that a lot of people claim is also a very important part of making a game survival horror, and that is fixed camera angles and tank controls. Every time a new survival horror game comes out, reportedly survival horror, again, there's a lot of debate on if, any game, what a survival horror game is to begin with. A lot of people will claim that it's not a survival horror game, and then one of the things they'll always list is that it needs to have tank controls, it needs to have fixed camera angles, and when you ask people why they feel this way, they'll give you some statement about how the tank controls or fixed camera angles are a deliberate design choice to heighten the mood because you can't see what's ahead, or the tank controls is like in a horror movie how characters will trip over their own feet. And not to disrespect anyone, but all of that is just complete and utter nonsense, and I'm going to explain why through this entire video. But before I go any further, I want to state for the record that tank controls and fixed camera angles are not necessarily bad game design in a survival horror game. While I'm personally not a big fan of them, when they work, they really work. For example, the Resident Evil 1 remake that I'm showing here uses fixed camera angles, uses tank controls. This is an excellent game on all fronts. It's fantastic. And recently there have been a lot of indie games coming out that use fixed camera angles and tank controls, using that to create a survival horror game. So games like Tormented Souls, Alicia, what's the other one? Crow Country, I think it's called. So yeah, the purpose of this video is not to say that a game is bad just because it uses tank controls or fixed camera angles. The purpose of this video is to basically explain why I feel they are irrelevant in whether or not something classifies as survival horror or not, and to explain why we actually need to look at the development of the original Resident Evil. So, for those of you who don't know, Resident Evil first started off development as a remake of Sweet Home, which was a horror RPG for the NES that was never released stateside. So, that was the original plan. They were just going to remake the game, but very early in development, they realized that there really wasn't a point to doing that, mostly because in order to remake the game, they would essentially have to relicense the movie that Sweet Home was based on. And considering that the only reason people remember the Sweet Home movie at all is because of the video game, they just didn't feel like it was worth spending the money to do that. So they decided to just completely, drop the Sweet Home connection and do something original. But there were still some things that they took from Sweet Home, namely the focus on exploration, puzzles, and resource management. But what they really struggled with was just trying to figure out how to bring that into 3D, which was the newest thing at the time. And it also didn't help that there also weren't a lot of horror games for them to draw inspiration from. You had Sweet Home, of course, which was a big inspiration. There was Project Firestart, which I have a feeling they weren't playing, despite how similar it is to Resident Evil. There's Clock Tower, which was released very close to that of Resident Evil, so they probably weren't taking influence from that either. And of course, you could list off some games that are debatably horror games, like System Shock, for example, and the game that really got the ball rolling on development, which was probably Doom. When Resident Evil moved into development, their first instinct was to use a first-person perspective, and it was probably because of the success that Doom was seeing at the time. It also helped that Doom had a very strong horror vibe to it, so they probably thought that would be a good fit for what they had in mind, because again, it would really get you immersed in this horror atmosphere. And really, while Doom is by no means a survival horror game, it is just a straight FPS, dude. That's not to say that the ideas of resource management and scares couldn't be applied to it to create a survival horror game, and I'm sure there are some Doom mods that have actually done that. But as they got underway with this direction, they quickly realized that it was going to be a really tall order to do this. Not only were they working on the weaker hardware of the PlayStation, which in and of itself struggled to run Doom, something like Doom, the team behind Resident Evil just didn't have a lot of experience with 3D gaming, and that was something a lot of Japanese developers struggled with at the time. You gotta remember, groundbreaking 3D games like Doom and what have you were not coming out of Japan, and they weren't as prominent in Japan, I would say, either. So because of that, they just didn't have the experience with 3D gaming that you were seeing in the West at the time. But they did come across one game that completely changed everything, and that was Alone in the Dark, which was a horror game that actually predates Resident Evil, and it's eerily similar. How the graphics worked in Alone in the Dark here is that rather than full 3D environments, the game uses a combination of 2D graphics and 3D graphics, so the backgrounds themselves are pre-rendered, meaning that what you're looking at here is a 2D static image, with the only 3D part being the character models themselves. So they then take the 3D character models and superimpose them over the 2D backgrounds in order to create this illusion of 3D. And you know what? It worked for what Alone in the Dark was trying to do. And the Resident Evil team realized very quickly, hey, this would probably work really well for the PlayStation. So they shifted gears, they dropped the first-person perspective, and began reworking the game in order to accommodate this new direction. And it ended up being a good fit for the PlayStation because not only could they have more detailed backgrounds with the 2D backgrounds, but it also meant that more resources could be allocated to the character models as well. So it was a smart choice on their part, and this design choice is what basically brought about the fixed camera angles and tank controls. So for starters, you have 2D backgrounds. These are not 3D environments, so you cannot rotate the camera, so you have no choice but to use fixed camera angles here. That is why they use fixed camera angles. It has nothing to do with the fact that it heightens the mood. Like, you can play a horror game with a third-person camera. You're in a tight corridor, you're not going to be able to see what's around the corridor. If it's dark, if it's foggy, you're not going to be able to see anything. You're still going to get the same thing. You do not need the fixed camera angles to do that. The fixed camera angles are there because they had no choice but to use them with the pre-rendered backgrounds. And because of the fixed camera angles, that's also why they ended up using the tank controls as well. If you've ever played a horror game from, say, the PS2 era, where they started trying to get away from, tank controls in favor of, more fluid analog controls, you realize that can be more cumbersome than anything, because with the fixed camera angles, controls that move based on the camera angle can be really problematic, because when the camera shifts to a drastically different camera angle, then your character will start spazzing back and forth because the input is constantly flip-flopping back and forth. And that can be really bad if you're in a situation where, you got a monster coming at you. So that's why they use the tank controls, because by having a single direction move your character forward and backward, regardless of what camera angle you're at, that fixes that problem. And that's why tank controls and fixed camera angles were a part of, Resident Evil to begin with. It had nothing to do with, trying to simulate, tripping over your own feet. Like, that's just complete and utter nonsense. And because Resident Evil was so damn successful, and because other developers were trying to figure out how to do 3D games as well, people just started copying Resident Evil. I mean, Resident Evil copied Alone in the Dark when it was in development as well. So, yeah, that's why so many horror games use the same fixed camera angles and tank controls. Now, over time, developers did start to try and break away from that. Games like Silent Hill, Dino Crisis, and Eternal Darkness, for example, they tried to get away from the fixed camera angles and go with a more dynamically shifting camera, actually using 3D environments instead of the pre-rendered backgrounds. And that worked just as well, especially in Alone in the Dark, which, if I recall correctly, has the analog controls, but because the camera moves dynamically with you instead of cutting most of the time, it's not as big an issue. So during the era of the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox, you saw developers, trying to move away from that because they realized pretty quickly that while during the PlayStation era, when Resident Evil and the survival horror genre as a whole was still a new and exciting thing, people were really interested in trying these games. But that changed with the coming of the new generation because suddenly survival horror games were a dime a dozen and they had become pretty uniform as well. So with new and exciting titles like Grand Theft Auto 3 coming out, for example, while there was still a dedicated fan base for these games, that fan base was not growing and in some cases shrinking. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, all these games coming out at the time, some of the best horror games ever, were often commercial disappointments at best or complete failures at worst, which, is why someone felt that the genre needed a shakeup, and that shakeup would come in the form of Resident Evil 4. Now, there is a lot of debate as to whether or not Resident Evil 4 counts as a survival horror game. And my 2 cents on it has always been yes, because it does have resource management, it does have combat, and it does try to scare you. However, I have always said it's not a particularly effective horror game. While it does put a lot of focus on the resource management, it really downplays the scares with its over-the-top action and everything. And let's be real, people remember Resident Evil 4 more for its exciting combat, innovative gameplay mechanics, all that good stuff. Not necessarily all the scary moments that occur in the game, like with Resident Evil 2 or the original Resident Evil. But again, I would still call it a survival horror game because it just barely tiptoes up to the line of being a pure action game without necessarily going over it. Which is what happened with Resident Evil 5, which, I'm not going to mince words, it's not a survival horror game, it's just a third-person shooter, and I would argue a very clunky one too. While Resident Evil 5 is still a ton of fun to play, it's just not a survival horror game by any stretch of the imagination. While it still does have resource management in there, it's been greatly simplified, no different from a standard third-person shooter. Combat has become front and center, and it doesn't bother to try to scare you anymore. And if it tries, it fails completely. And I feel this is why so many people are resistant to the idea that anything that does not have fixed camera angles or tank controls doesn't count as a survival horror game. Because during the time of the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360, all that stuff, any game that claimed to be survival horror was typically just an action game with a slight horror theme to it, much like Resident Evil 5, and the reason that happened was because Resident Evil 5 was so damn successful. I think it's still the most successful game that Capcom has ever put out, believe it or not. And this is also where that trend of horror games coming out that thought they were being scary by just removing the ability to combat the threats that come at you, which, as I've stated before, doesn't really make something a scary game, let alone a survival horror game. All these games are just hide-and-seek simulators. That's all there is to it. It's funny to think that people looked at Resident Evil 4 as this big, innovative title when it came out, and like a revelation in the survival horror genre, but they wouldn't actually get it right until years later with Resident Evil 7, which was the first time that the gameplay mechanics of something like Resident Evil 4 were applied in a manner that I would actually call survival horror. The combat, it's been reined in a great deal. It is still there, but you still feel incredibly vulnerable, which leads to a lot of resource management, and it can be pretty damn scary too. And they later perfected it a few years later with the Resident Evil 2 remake. And just a heads up, for this entire series, the Resident Evil 2 remake is going to be the benchmark I always talk about when I'm referring to, all the elements that I feel make up a survival horror game. I will talk about other franchises, but, that's the one I always think of when people ask me, what's a survival horror game? Tell them, look at this game. This is a survival horror game. And we're going to start getting into why that works. But yeah, tank controls, fits camera angles, completely irrelevant, not bad design. You can make your game play however you want. You can make the camera work as well as you want, as long as everything is designed around it. And there are plenty of games in the genre that do that and make for incredibly effective horror games. I just do not feel that they're required to make something a survival horror game. But with that out of the way, let's actually start digging into the elements of what actually makes something a survival horror game. And we're going to start off with horror, so tune in next time as I tell you guys how to achieve horror in a video game. I'll see you then.